In chapter 7, we were told that Ezra made the journey from Babylon to Jerusalem, accompanied by a number of Israelites. Chapter 8 is like a flashback to earlier in the narrative, and it tells us the story of that journey from Babylon to Jerusalem. Now, what I find interesting is that it appears that this journey is deliberately designed in the scriptures to point us back to the Exodus from Egypt. You look at the family groups that gather for the journey, and you will notice that there are 12 distinct groups, symbolic of the 12 tribes of Israel. They gather by the water on their way out of Babylon, assembling at the canal that flows towards Ahava. They are between their old home and their new home, and there you have the people of God camping out mid-journey, waiting by the water. There's a problem though, and that is that there are no Levites in this particular group. You'll remember that the tribe of Levi is not counted among the 12 tribes, but Levi was one of the sons of Jacob, and it's troubling that there are no Levites there, at least here in verse 15. But Ezra responds to the problem. He summons some of the leaders of the people and sends them to go and round up willing Levites, people who will be willing to assist the people of God along the journey. You might ask the question, okay, I see some of the parallels, but what is the big miracle here in Ezra 8? Because we all know what the miracle was in the Exodus story, right? The parting of the Red Sea. There seems to be no parallel in this account that ensured the safety of God's people. Well, Ezra would beg to differ. 3 times in this chapter, Ezra writes about the hand of God being upon them. In other words, this journey would not have been successful if it were not for God. He has supernaturally intervened to ensure their safety. Just as the ancient Israelites crossed the Red Sea and were saved from their enemies, so these Israelites right here were also protected from their enemies. And that would not have been the case if it had not been for God. How do we know that? Well, look at verse 18. It was the gracious hand of God that was upon them. Look at verse 22. Here, Ezra is telling the king that the gracious hand of God is upon them, and therefore they do not need an army of soldiers from the king of Babylon to accompany them on the journey, because the gracious hand of God is upon them. And finally, in verse 31, they set out from the canal and made their way to Jerusalem, and they did it safely for one reason, and one reason only, because the hand of God was upon them. Do you see that Ezra perceives this as being miraculous? Because in any ordinary world, they would not have made this journey safely. This is a fact that is perhaps lost on many of us, but travel in the ancient world was immensely dangerous, especially long-distance travel when you are carrying an extraordinary amount of wealth with you. And they were. Verse 26, Ezra says, I weighed out to them 650 talents of silver articles weighing 100 talents, 100 talents of gold, 20 bowls of gold valued at 1,000 darics, that is darics, not derricks, which as a unit of currency is of questionable value. But a daric, however, is apparently 19 pounds or 8.4 kilograms, and 2 fine articles of polished bronze as precious as gold. To make this journey with this wealth and without an army is absolutely unthinkable, and they were perfectly safe. That is the miracle, Ezra would say, and it happened because the gracious hand of God was upon them. There's a fascinating story back in the book of Genesis where Abraham's nephew Lot got into a spot of trouble. He was taken off as part of the spoils of war and would presumably have been forced to face a lifetime of slavery from that point on. But Abraham took it upon himself to rescue Lot. And suddenly, only here we find out that within Abraham's household, he has a private army consisting of 318 trained soldiers. Abraham had a private army traveling with him. Now, why did Abraham need a private army? Well, because the Bible says he was extremely wealthy. And you can imagine how a man like that would attract the attention of people with evil intentions. Likewise, Jesus told a story about a man taking a much shorter journey from Jerusalem down to Jericho, and he was viciously attacked along the way. Travel in this era was very dangerous, and these people are going on an enormous journey, and they are carrying basically the contents of a bank with them through the open country on their travels, and yet The whole journey is conducted in total safety, and the reason for it all is because of the gracious hand of God. Upon first reading, we might think that everything going on here is pretty ordinary, but Ezra sets us straight. Ezra helps us to see the gracious hand of God in action. I wonder if we sometimes go through life pretty oblivious to the many blessings we have received, and it's only when somebody else comes along and points out the gracious hand of God in our lives that we are then able to recognize and to rejoice in all that God has done for us. So, something to consider today. What things do you tend to take for granted, but are only possible for you because the gracious hand of God is upon you?